Europe finds itself in one of its most precarious positions in recent years. While on the surface, sanctions between the EU and China might seem like a minor dispute, the reality is far more dangerous. China's recent sanctions against two small European banks were more than just an economic move. They were a signal, a warning shot that Beijing can strike much larger institutions if needed. But how did we get here? And why is Europe caught in the crossfire of global economic and geopolitical tensions? The saga began when the European Union imposed sanctions on Chinese banks, accusing them of aiding Russia in evading international sanctions. This is part of the broader Western strategy of isolating Russia due to its invasion of Ukraine. But while it may seem like a standard diplomatic move, the EU's sanctions have far-reaching consequences. The European sanctions targeted two small Chinese banks, the Swifenhe Rural Commercial Bank and the Hehe Rural Commercial Bank. These institutions primarily operate locally in China, dealing mostly with regional trade, financing, and even some crypto operations. The EU's reasoning behind these sanctions was that these banks were allegedly helping Russia circumvent financial penalties, especially in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine. As of August 9th, European businesses were banned from engaging in transactions with these banks. At first glance, these sanctions may seem like a mere formality. The banks involved don't have a presence in Europe, they don't have clients there, and they don't process transactions in the European financial system. So why would the EU impose sanctions on them in the first place? The answer lies in the geopolitical dynamics between the West and China. China was quick to respond. On August 13th, Beijing announced sanctions against two small Lithuanian banks, UAB Urbankas and AB Monobankas. These institutions are not major players in the global financial system either. In fact, they are local banks operating mainly in Lithuania's domestic market. But the symbolism behind China's response was powerful. This was not a random choice. The Lithuanian government had been at odds with China ever since 2021, when Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a representative office in its capital, Vilnius. China viewed this as a provocative move and swiftly retaliated by downgrading diplomatic relations with Lithuania. The imposition of sanctions on these Lithuanian banks was part of this broader conflict. It was not just about the size of the banks, but about sending a clear message. If Europe continues to antagonize China, there will be consequences. The EU's decision to align itself with Washington and impose sanctions on China was a strategic misstep. While Brussels may have been aiming to show unity with the US in the global fight against Russia, it failed to consider the broader economic implications. Europe is far more dependent on China than it lets on. The trade relationship between the EU and China is massive. In 2024, trade between the two regions reached almost 800 billion euros. China is a vital market for European automobiles, luxury goods, and industrial equipment. German automakers like Volkswagen and BMW sell more cars in China than they do in their home country. Similarly, French luxury goods companies like LVMH rely heavily on Chinese consumers for champagne, fashion, and other high-end products. But it's not just about European exports to China. Europe is also heavily reliant on imports from China. Critical goods like solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, rare earth metals, and pharmaceuticals come from China. Without these, the EU's green transition and shift to renewable energy and electric mobility could come to a standstill. This stark dependence is why the EU's sanctions against two small Chinese banks are so perplexing. It is a high-risk strategy that threatens Europe's economic interests without offering any tangible benefits in return. In fact, it has only served to provoke China, a partner that Europe cannot afford to lose. So why did the EU impose sanctions despite the obvious risks? The answer lies in the influence of Washington. The United States has long been a dominant force in the global financial system. The US dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency, and Washington has used its economic power to exert pressure on countries around the world. But now, Washington is worried about the growing influence of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and their efforts to create alternatives to the dollar. In recent weeks, former President Donald Trump has made his position clear. He warned BRICS countries that if they attempt to create a system that bypasses the dollar, they will face severe economic consequences, including tariffs of up to 10% on all goods traded between them and the U.S. This warning sent shockwaves around the world, signaling that Washington is prepared to use its economic might to maintain the dominance of the dollar in global trade. Europe, under pressure from the U.S., has followed Washington's lead, even though it means sacrificing its own economic interests. The EU's sanctions against Chinese banks were partly an attempt to show solidarity with the U.S. and punish China for its support of Russia. But in doing so, Europe has found itself caught between two global giants, both of whom are demanding its loyalty. The consequences of this situation are already being felt in Europe. One of the clearest examples of this is Italy, a country that has found itself at the crossroads of U.S.-China tensions. Italy's industrial sector has long relied on Chinese investments and access to the Chinese market. Take Pirelli, the iconic Italian tire manufacturer. A significant portion of Pirelli's shares are owned by a Chinese state-owned corporation, Sinochem. The idea behind this partnership was to gain access to the burgeoning Chinese automotive market, which is one of the largest in the world. However, things have not gone as planned. Despite the promise of growth in China, Pirelli found itself caught in the crosshairs of U.S. national security concerns. The U.S. government blocked Pirelli's tires from being sold in Formula One races in America, citing national security risks. This is a glaring example of how U.S. policy can directly impact European companies, even when those companies are not involved in controversial issues like the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But Pirelli is not the only company feeling the heat. German exports to China have declined sharply since 2022, especially in the automotive and precision machinery sectors. This has been compounded by the EU's decision to reject Russian energy, forcing European industries to rely on more expensive energy resources. Manufacturers in Europe are now paying 2 to 3 times more for energy than their counterparts in Asia, eroding their competitiveness. As a result, many European factories are scaling back production, shifting operations abroad, or laying off workers. As if this weren't enough, the U.S. is preparing to escalate the trade war further. Leaks from the U.S. administration indicate that Washington is planning to impose tariffs of up to 300% on foreign microchips. The aim is to force major Asian chip manufacturers like TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, Samsung, and Japan's Tokyo Electron to relocate their supply chains to the United States. The consequences of this move could be catastrophic for both the U.S. and European economies. If Asian manufacturers comply, the cost of microchips will soar, increasing the price of everything from smartphones and laptops to electric vehicles and defense systems. If they refuse, American consumers will bear the brunt of the price hikes. Meanwhile, the global semiconductor supply chain, already under strain, will face even more pressure, potentially leading to shortages in critical sectors. The stakes are high. Washington's tariff war is not just about trade, it's about attempting to seize control of the global semiconductor market. But this is a risky gamble. If the U.S. pushes too hard, it could provoke countermeasures that damage its own tech sector and disrupt the global economy. As Europe finds itself squeezed between the pressure from Washington and retaliation from China, it must ask itself, will it continue to sacrifice its own interests to please the U.S., or will it start defending its own economic sovereignty? Europe's alignment with Washington's agenda is making it vulnerable not only to China's retaliation, but also to the global shift away from the dollar. The BRICS countries are increasingly building alternatives to the U.S.-led financial system. They are creating new payment systems and promoting trade in national currencies. The EU, instead of being a bridge between these competing powers, is increasingly tied to Washington's agenda, even as the U.S. itself faces declining leverage on the global stage. Europe could have chosen a more independent path, one that defended its economic interests and promoted cooperation with both the U.S. and China. but instead, it has aligned itself with a partner whose influence is waning, leaving Europe vulnerable to the shifting tides of global trade and finance. The next few years will be crucial for Europe. Its response to the ongoing crisis will determine its role in the new world order. Will Europe continue to act as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, or will it finally assert its independence and stand up for its own interests? This is the central question that will shape Europe's future. The stakes are high, and the consequences of Europe's choices will be felt for generations to come.